we continue to explore the place that it said that we arrive at when we no longer need to try, when we no longer need to strive, quest, seek. And it's already been said before that it has been found that it's in the Sufi stories, the allegories, that we find the most sacred symbols, archetypes, and numbers. But it's also been found that these Sufi stories and allegories contain a secret. And it's asked of you at the outset, could it be that in the last sentence of most of these stories, that there is the code, the key that can be considered to be that secret? So it's asked of you, what for you is the meaning of the sentence which says, they got married and begot many sons? But first there's the Sufi Allegory, long and perhaps convoluted, but filled with those symbols and architects and numbers. It's the story about a king, and he had 3 sons, able-bodied sons. But this king liked the finer things of life. In particular, he loved his garden, which was cultivated with every flower and plant that one could find. But amongst those flowers and plants, there was one particular flower that bloomed all year round, that was more beautiful and more fragrant than any other. And the king would oftentimes go out into his garden to smell and see this flower. But one day when he was out on one of these excursions, he found that one of these magnificent blooms had been cut and was missing. And again, the next day, and the next day, the flower was being decimated of its blooms. So it was decided that one of the sons would go and keep vigil to see what it was that was stealing this beautiful flower. So the eldest son took up his vigil one night, but of course, after a busy day hunting and the rest, he was very tired, so his eyes soon nodded, and he was asleep and did not even hear the trunching and grinding of something that came to steal the flower, and sure enough the flower was gone in the morning. So it was the time of the second son to go out into the garden and keep his vigil, but he too, after a busy day jousting and playing and feasting, his eyes soon nodded off, and he did not hear the snipping of the branch or the breaking of the twigs as whoever it was or whatever it was that came to steal the bloom. So it came to the time of the third son to keep vigil, and so the third son, ensuring that he would be awake, he cut himself with his sword, and he rubbed salt into the wound, so that whenever his eyes nodded off, the stinging of his wound would wake him up. So he kept his vigil, and sure enough, trump, 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 the sounds of someone or something approaching caught him to be totally vigilant and awake, and then he saw it, a demon of huge size coming to snip the bloom. Quickly the prince took his sword and parried with the demon, but he was only able to wound the creature, and it went lumbering off. But of course, he went back to his father and his brothers and told them what had happened. So it was decided that all three of them would go and follow the trail of blood that showed the way that the creature had gone. And so the trail of blood led them to an empty well. And of course it's said in other stories that this is the abode of demons, afrits and ghouls. So again, it was the first son who said, I'm going to go down into the well. And so he was lowered down, but he hadn't gone very far in his descent when the sounds that came from the bottom of the well was so disturbing that he quickly pulled the rope and had himself pulled up. And then the second son went down, but suddenly something banged against the edge of the well, and he too was terrified and quickly pulled the rope to be pulled out. And it was the third son who said before he made the descent, if I call and pull the rope, it is to indicate that I want you to let out more rope. So when the young prince was lowered into the well, and of course he did call, and more rope was let out for him, he found himself at the bottom of the well. And although it was dark, of course there was enough light coming from the sky above for him to see a little, and he found himself at the opening of a passageway. So he followed this passageway along, and it led to a great door. And when he opened the door and entered, he was in a magnificent place, a palace like no other. But as he explored this place, suddenly he came across a chamber, and when he opened the door, there in front of him was a most beautiful maiden, and around her neck was the garland of the flowers that had been gathered. But on her lap lay the head of a ghastly demon. Now this being, this maiden, a princess of course, pointed silently to the demon's sword laying beside it, and the prince took up this sword. But before striking his fatal blow, he awoke the demon, because he was a brave man. He was not going to just kill his foe. And so it happened. He slayed the demon. The princess was able to tell her story of her capture and enslavement with the demon. But then they were at a dilemma, how to find their way out of this place. So they explored somewhat, and they found themselves in what was an inner atrium, you might say. And as they entered that atrium, there was sitting an old man with a long beard. And he spoke to them, and he said, there are 2 rams, one white and one black, and they were always fighting. But you can ride one or the other, and they will take you to where you must be. So the prince grabbed the horns of the white ram and held it tight while the princess got on its back. And in the blink of an eye, she found herself at the top of the well where the 2 princes awaited. And they saw her beauty and, of course, immediately fell in love with her and wanted her for themselves. But they went back to the palace, and the king asked, "Where is my youngest son?" And they said, "He's lost at the bottom of the well." So there was great mourning. But then there's the prince, and he himself climbed on the back of the black ram. And this ram took him down, 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 through the several levels of existence. Dizzying it was, but he found himself in a dark place. But when his eyes grew accustomed to the dark, his senses heightened. He heard the screechings. And when he looked, he saw a nest of fledgling griffins. And they were screaming in distress. And when he looked, he saw a snake menacing the fledglings, about to take them as its prey. So the prince immediately took out his sword and struck off the head of the snake, saving the young fledglings, and he chopped up the snake to feed the starving birds who were waiting for their great mother to return. But when the great female griffin came back, the first thing she saw was this human who she thought was menacing her children, and she was about to strike. When suddenly those fledglings gathered around the prince to protect him from this mother about to strike. And then she saw the blood and realized from the pieces of the snake that remained what had happened, and recognized that it was this being who had saved her children, her 7 fledglings. So she said, "I am in your debt. How can I repay you?" And he said, "Of course, I wish to return to my home place." "Ah," said the great griffin, "that is a great task. I must undertake it because I owe you this debt. But I cannot traverse those dimensions without food." And so it was that the prince gathered from around that place 7 lambs. And as they ascended through the dimensions of existence, at each level the prince fed the griffin a lamb, and so she had the strength to rise into the next, and the next, and the next. But just as they were approaching the last lamb fell from the grip of the prince and descended down. But the griffin was on the last of her strength. So all that the prince could do was to sever his own leg and pass it to the griffin to give her the strength to traverse the last dimension. But the griffin looked at this leg and smelled the blood, and with this she was able to gather the last of the strength that was needed to come out from those dimensions. She handed back the prince's leg and licked the wound, saying, "Place the leg back and it will be healed." And so it was. And then the griffin disappeared again into the depths to return to her fledglings. The prince, of course, came to the palace and was greeted by the king and told his story. The end of the story we know. The two brothers were relegated to minor roles within the palace. The prince claimed the maiden for himself. They married and begot many sons. We have no need to analyze any more the symbols, the archetypes, the sacred numbers. They've melded within us in all their forms, every story being our story. But this secret, this key, this answer to our inquiries, what for you is the meaning of the sentence, "They married and begot many sons"? What's happening for you in your relationship with life? The interaction of what it is that is said that is this place where we no longer need to try, to strive, to quest, to seek. And life's experiences coming in and meeting with us. What is the meaning for you of this ending to so many of the stories and allegories?
So when we come to a place of harmony, the many gifts are abound.